I love cookies. I love cookies. I love cookies. I love cookies.
Welcome to Cookies, the world's most influential basketball podcast. We have yet another perfect pod awaiting you. Special guest, whose name you've seen on the title for this episode. But nevertheless, Andrew Kuo is going to give him a hero's welcome. Andrew, talk to us.
Welcome, Kelefa Sanneh, to the most influential basketball podcast. Kay has written a new book called Major Labels, writer for The New Yorker, previously The New York Times, and various other esteemed publications. Kay, man, great to hear you.
Dude, do you guys have like a siren or some sort of sound effect that you play to alert the pod listeners when you're inviting on a guest who doesn't know about basketball? Is there how does this work?
That can be arranged. It's kind of like a low sort of air horn, like it's the sound of a brick jumper clanging off the back of a rim.
Did I already mess this up? Was the idea that my basketball influence would be my basketball ignorance would be revealed slowly through the course of the pod, and I just kind of like, this is a spoiler?
That was all we really wanted to cover.
Do you know about basketball, Kay? Well, the short answer is no. No, I don't.
What is the most depressing sound in a basketball game? Is it like the horn going off, like meh? Is it a whistle from a crooked ref?
I was like, as someone who has been to like a few basketball games, despite not knowing much about basketball, there's something depressing about the sneaky start to the second half.
Yeah, they want everyone to get those hot dogs, those glizzies.
Yeah, they want everyone to get their hot dogs. So like the second half starts anticlimactically on purpose. I don't know if this is something you've already covered on the pod, but that was always surprising to me when I went to basketball games.
I don't think I've ever seen the actual tip-off of a Knicks game. I mean, maybe a couple times, but generally speaking.
You're saying the first half and the second half?
Yes.
Okay.
Never
What
really
are you doing?
see
You're having
what happens.
getting a pastrami sandwich, getting situated.
Yeah, it's generally finding and beer, shepherding it back to the seat, and then it's always very disgraceful when you're trying to get to your seat and they won't let you go until there's a break in the action. And
you have to explain to them, I'm a podcaster, I'm sitting on the floor, this is kind of important, I need to be in position by the time the TV cameras are rolling.
So
I've got my beer, my pretzel, and I'm just there standing impotently at the top of the stairs.
Courtside.
I've been to games with both you guys. And you guys have distinctly different styles, for sure. And this checks out. Ben is a chiller, great thing. We're usually hanging out, drinking beer, meeting up with friends that he knows are in the stadium. Kay is also a chiller, but my preferred way, because I like to sit in my seat like way before it starts and kind of like watch everybody warm up. Is that?
I want everything to be situated. Also, like, when it comes to sports, like, I watch a lot of fights. And like with boxing, you can't mess around because you don't know when the fight's going to end. So you have to be there, situated from the opening bell. Otherwise, like, you could miss it. Mm-hmm. And we were at
boxing. I would not dare to show up late for a boxing match.
Remember, we were at it was like a Golovkin fight, right? Gennady Golovkin at the Garden, and our friend came to join us and like found his seat a couple rounds late and was there like maybe less than a minute before Golovkin knocked the dude out.
Yeah, that was crazy. And someone else was sitting in a seat.
That's right.
And your friend was large, and he rolls up, and the guy was ready to put up a fight, and he's like, "Oh, I'll just move. The seat is not mine."
I was like, "Oh, is that what the world would look like if I were maybe somewhat imposing as opposed to not at all imposing?" It was interesting to know.
Yeah, I've never had that problem.
Was it David Lemieux? Maybe I can't remember which fight. It might have been David Lemieux where Golovkin knocked him out in the 8th. Not sure, but yes, that is my style. I feel a little nervous until I found my seat.
When you were described in the New York Times, they called you reedy? Did they say wiry?
Reedy, yeah.
Reedy.
Is that it? Wayfish?
reedy, wayfish. There was a lot of. I was surprised that when the Times profiled me, 95% of the piece was about my body, which was a big surprise to me. I didn't know that was going to be so interesting to people.
My eyes are up here. Yeah, not to be mistaken with basketball legend Paul Reed, aka B-Ball Paul, who's also reedy in both ways.
Paul Reed is reedy.
He's reedy.
That's there's a word for that, right? Aptronym, right? Someone whose name properly describes them by coincidence.
This guy reads books.
Something we don't encourage here at Cookies until our book comes out on November 9th.
Is there another sound effect you play when you mention your book?
This is the highfalutin sound.
That's right.
More
fancy sound.
More air horns. Yeah. Speaking of books, so you've got one. It's about Major Lazer, Diplo's side project.
It's called Major Lazers. Yeah, it took a couple years of my life to write all about. No, it's called The Joy of Music.
Yes. Yeah, it's called Major Labels.
Major Labels, yeah. I decided to sit down and write a quote-unquote history of music.
It's awesome, man. You go through 7 genres. Can you talk about the 7?
I can talk about what a grim day it was when I sat down in front of an empty Google Docs file and had to type like Chapter 1, rock and roll. That was not a good feeling at all, because I realized I'd signed up to do something sort of insane. No, the idea was kind of simple in a way. It was that I've been writing about music since, I guess, the 90s. I think the first thing that someone published was in CMJ in 1994.
What era was that? Was that Nirvana? Did Nirvana play Roseland? It was just
post-Nirvana. I think I remember reviewing an early Mountain Goats release.
Still a relevant band.
Yeah, and although John Darnielle and I are probably the only 2 people in the world that would remember that.
Both boxing fans, to go on the record.
Well, yeah, and it was early for him, and it was very early for me, and so both him and I think, were both like, "Whoa, we're in CMJ." But so I've been doing that for a while, and I started to feel like, oh, I have a theory, or I have an idea about how music works. Why don't I try to write it down? So, and what I realized was that I thought genres were interesting. I thought the idea of people, I'm maybe one of you, but maybe not the other. Like, my gateway to caring about music was caring about punk rock, and that was such a genre, that was such a tribe, that was like you jump into this punk rock world and then you're supposed to hate everything else, and you're supposed to be like, this is what I like and everything else is crap. And, that kind of got me fascinated in thinking about how genres work and how these communities work. So I decided to tell the history of music by telling the history of 7 quote-unquote major genres, which in my book are rock and roll, R&B, country music, punk rock, hip hop, dance music, and pop music, in that order.
I thought it was interesting that you have 2 separate genres for trip hop and jungle.
I was going to say, is the drum and bass book does that have 7 categories within that?
People were like, "Are you sure you need to split death metal into blackened death metal and melodic death metal?" And I was like, "Look, these things stand alone." No, that's the question, right? It's like how much you want to zoom in or how much you want to zoom out, right? Someone else could write a book where like popular music is one genre and like classical music is another genre.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's always a question of zooming in and zooming out, but I kind of, I figured I would focus on stuff that I'm kind of obsessed with, like pop charts and who's selling concert tickets and who's selling albums. And so these were kind of, I figured like in the last 50 years, these were good divisions to talk about 7 different tribes that had that kind of commercial impact.
And it's kind of like de-evolving now, right? Because I feel in 2021, if you're a music fan, you kind of accept all of these ideas as one thing, as opposed to when we were growing up, it's just like, yo, not only do I not mess with that, I'm into this tribe, and within this tribe, this is my tribe. And now it's just like, it feels like a better way to be a fan now, I think. Like, is it more accepting?
This is one of the things I learned, like, from reliving this history, is that that's always happening. Like, throughout history, that's always happening, and then it's unhappening. In other words, like, there's this moment in, I think it's 1963, where Billboard eliminates its R&B chart, and they say the reason they're doing it is because all these R&B records are going pop and crossing over, and, like, all this music is coming together, and maybe it doesn't make sense to have a different R&B chart because it's all going to be one. And, you know, in the mid-'60s, you read articles about, like, the rock and roll rebellion or the rise of rock and roll, and they're talking about, like, the Rolling Stones and the Supremes, like it's all part of the same movement.
Right.
But then you move a little forwards into the early 70s, and it seems totally different again, right? It seems like Diana Ross is over here, and the Rolling Stones are over there, and it's starting to seem obvious that they're making different music. In fact, R&B kind of gets renamed soul music in the late 60s, early 70s, and part of the idea is to emphasize the idea that R&B is black music, that it's separate from what's happening in rock and roll, that soul is not just something you play, it's like something you have, and it's linked to race, it's linked to the idea of music having a message, and that's one way that it can be a little more set apart from, like, rock bands, right? And then by the late 70s, you have the disco era, and everything's coming together again. Like what you said, Quo, about this being a moment when everyone listens to everything, like, disco was kind of a moment like that too, right? And it's like, oh, it's everything. It's R&B, but it's also like Rod Stewart and the Bee Gees and the Rolling Stones and all these rock groups are making disco records, and it's also Latin music coming through with like Sal Soul records and all this stuff, and it's string sections, and it's electronic music coming from the European, like the German tradition, and everything's coming together, and it's all one music, right? That's a late 70s thing, and then that creates a backlash to that, right? With everyone being like, with a movement of people saying disco sucks, and that's a rock thing, but that's also a punk thing, and that's also, even in the world of dance music, you have dance DJs and producers, feeling a backlash to disco, and like, we're sick of disco duck and all this novelty stuff, we're going to make underground records, and that kind of goes on to create house and techno. So that feeling, I think those are two very human feelings, and even very American feelings, is like, one, the feeling of like, the walls are coming down, man, it's all about freedom, we can listen to everything, and we can all get together. And then the opposite of that, which is like, we don't want to be like those people aren't cool, we're doing our own thing over here, and like, we're building some walls back up. And so there's this back and forth that you see. And so when you see this current moment where, again, it seems like things are sort of coming together, and like Lil Nas X and Post Malone and a lot of artists that, you know, get a lot of streams now are kind of like touching all sorts of different genres, and it feels like everyone's listening to everything and things are coming together. There's part of me that thinks like, oh, maybe that just sets the stage for like another generation of musicians and listeners to find ways to set themselves apart and to say like, that stuff is normal, that stuff is basic, we don't want to be like that, we're actually doing our own thing over here.
Sort of like, yeah.
Well, like in the modern sense, that could take a technological form, right? That could take the form of a whole bunch of musicians that say, we don't want our tracks on Spotify, we don't want them on Apple Music. Those outlets like don't share our values, don't pay very well. If you want to hear us, you have to come to some other, you have to come to Bandcamp, or you have to come to some other site where we're going to live outside of that system, right? So you can hear it that way. Or you could imagine just like culturally that certain artists, because they're very popular, a new generation like doesn't see that as cool or doesn't see that as interesting and finds its own thing. So when I kind of look at that history, it seems like a real pendulum swinging backward and forward. And I think it's true that the 90s, when I was in high school, when you were in high school, was an unusually tribal moment, right? There's even that Gathering of the Tribes concert, which was like a kind of a precursor to Lollapalooza. And this idea that like, you know, based on what kind of pants you wear, you can tell like what kind of music you listen to, right? That's a very 90s thing that happened. And yes, we're kind of at the other extreme right now, which maybe means the pendulum's about to swing backward.
Yeah, I was thinking about, you know, you coining the phrase rockism, I guess, let's say 17 years ago. You didn't coin it. I thought that was you.
I helped popularize it in a modern context, but rockism is something that emerges from the British music press in the early 1980s. And so
Okay,
it's this
okay, I stand
ongoing
corrected.
debate. And I wrote this essay about rockism in the New York Times in 2004, which sort of like got a bunch of people arguing again. Yes, but I cannot claim to have invented the term.
Thank you for setting the record straight. That was a test in
No
the
stolen
past.
valor here.
So my question about that was, flash forward to today and what we're talking about, this sort of homogenizing effect in some ways where we all say, oh, like Beyonce. You don't like Beyonce? What's wrong with you? We all collectively love Beyonce. We all stan Rihanna. Bieber, slapper. How did you not like that?
Right.
Is there
It's a bop.
a pendulum that has swung too far in a way? Are we missing a little
What the hell is a
tribalism
boom
in
bap
some
beat?
senses?
Well, we're always missing something, right? Like that's the idea. Like there's so much music being made, and you could never pay attention to all of it. And while you're paying attention to one thing, there's something else happening outside of your frame of vision that you're not keying into. And one thing that people who listen to music and write about music and think about music for a living can do is like help you think through like what you might be missing and why. Right, like for a while in the late 2010s, I started to feel like with the boom in EDM, it seemed like the EDM wave was a good example of a kind of music that was super popular and got very little respect from most of the people that were serious about music. In that way, it was kind of similar to disco. Right?
Are you
It's
talking
like-
about like the Las Vegas like huge DJ scene?
Yeah. Yes.
Arbitha. Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. And like and those records, some of which I thought were totally great, were in some ways kind of ignored, and this thing was happening with kids, and then you saw like it still exists, but you saw it kind of deflate, not with a huge backlash, but there was a sort of a perception that world of like, Alesso playing like mega clubs was somehow uncool. And so, that's another that's another example of it, right? That there's always something that people aren't paying enough attention to or aren't taking seriously. And even in this moment, right? Even in this moment of, where quote unquote everyone is expected to, express that, that Rihanna is amazing or whatever. Although it's weird, the deification of Rihanna, a lot of it has happened since her last album. So a lot of it's happened like actually in the absence of new music from Rihanna.
Yo, this happens in sports all the time. There's this player, Jason Tatum, on the Celtics, who gets better without playing any games. It's wild. It's like, has he entered the top
Tatum? It's because Tatum always is seen leaving clubs with carrying a wine glass, and it just adds to the mythology of Tatum
wait,
over
does
and
this
over how
suggest-
much he's slaying.
Does this suggest that he brings his own wine glass to the club?
Well, I mean, I'm just referring to Rihanna's viral penchant for always leaving carrying a glass of wine wherever she goes.
She needs that. She needs that thing that they had at Keen's Steakhouse, right in Midtown, where they have the pipes on the ceiling. So you could, like in the old days, you could leave your pipe at the restaurant and they'd have it for you.
That's a wild restaurant. We'll be getting into beef rooms later.
Oh,
but-
excuse me. I'm sorry. I skipped forward in our agenda. I'm supposed to be flogging my book mercilessly, right? This is.
Oh yeah. Let's do that. So there was a conversation the three of us had over Ann Beer at Ann Bar about a month ago, and we were talking about offensiveness in music. And
Were we
I brought up
celebrating Quo's birthday? Is this what was happening?
Yes, and
I
I brought
almost
up
ate a slice of pizza.
a certain favorite. His name is RX Nephew. He comes up on this pod frequently, and I was like, I like this guy,
Rochester.
but I don't know how. Yes, of course, how it's going to work because he says really offensive stuff constantly. He's saying offensive stuff, and can that work today? And you made a point that rap isn't supposed to not be offensive, and I thought that's something that doesn't really get discussed that much anymore. That
Well, yeah, and I would.
since when is it supposed to be safe?
Well, supposed is like a tricky word, right? Because who's to say what rap is or isn't supposed to be? But I would say that throughout its history, rap has traditionally been considered offensive. And sometimes that can be. That's expressed in sort of extreme forms, right? Like when someone goes to jail for selling a 2 Live Crew record in the early 90s, right? Like,
Wow, yeah.
that's insane. And
insane.
in the end, Two Live Crew like prevails legally, and like that music is not illegal to sell. And some of its defendants is a song that leads over the years. You can see the influence of that in a song like WAP, which was controversial, but not controversial the way Two Live Crew was. And a lot of people, certainly in the media, celebrated that as an exciting song and a kind of empowering song. But I think one of the striking things, if you look at the history of hip hop, certainly since the early 80s, is there's never really been a moment where hip hop sits comfortably in the mainstream of American culture. There's never really been a moment when the people that have big voices and a lot of influence look around at what's going on in hip hop and just say like, oh yeah, this is great. This music is great. We love this. Right? It's not as if Run DMC was being celebrated at the White House when they were coming out, right? And then, a couple years later, you get to NWA and it's like a full-fledged panic over what's happening with NWA. Public Enemy, wildly controversial, the stuff that happens with Professor Griff. The mid-'90s is still a lot of talk about so-called gangster rap and how it's leading people astray. By the late 90s, you have this growing perception that big money and jewelry and violence are all coming together in this really disturbing way. Obviously, the unsolved murders of Tupac in '96 and B.I.G. in 1997 freaks a lot of people out and causes a lot of people to think that maybe hip-hop has lost its way, which is funny because now, of course, the music of, Notorious B.I.G. or Tupac Shakur, that's looked at as maybe that's the era when hip-hop had substance, or when hip-hop was, Notorious B.I.G. is, celebrated by the city of New York, but like that certainly wasn't happening when he was putting those records out in the late 90s. So, I think when you see modern controversies over hip hop, and you see, controversies over, DaBaby making his remarks about gay people and AIDS, and there being a big backlash to that, it's hard for me not to see that as being part of this longer tradition and being in some ways not very surprising in that, there is this long history of hip hop being kind of uncomfortable and finding new ways to unsettle, annoy, and offend new generations of listeners. And when I say that, I don't mean to assume by saying that people are wrong to be annoyed or unsettled or offended by hip hop. I want to be careful. I'm not saying like, oh no, that's ridiculous. You should listen to Two Live Crew and be fine with it. Like, no, that you can. There's good reasons to understand why someone would be offended by the sight of Nelly swiping a credit card through a woman's buttocks in a video, right? Like, there's good reasons to understand why at various times people have said like, wait a second, that's what you're saying on a hip hop track? Like, we don't like that.
My favorite was when someone came out after Lil Nas X for his Satan shoe, be like, that's the last time I play your music for my kid. And he's like, Old Town Road is a nasty song. Like, that's about doing something very filthy. Like, you're playing that for your kids?
Right.
Like, not my fault.
But even Lil Nas X is a good example of the ways in which the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable have really changed. Because you don't see... there are people who are kind of denouncing Lil Nas X, but they tend not to be in the mainstream of the cultural discourse, right? There are people, you hear that maybe from some conservative commentators, maybe Lil Boozy says something in an interview, right?
What has
Lord
Boozy
Jamar has
Right.
got some stuff to say on this topic.
Right, but it's not like. But that's
Shout
not
out to
the
Boosie
equivalent
though.
of,
Boosie is on it when it comes to gay news.
Boozy is logged on. Yes.
He knows every nuance. He is up to date.
But he's found a way, he's resonating partly in that way, and that's a lot of the reason why people are talking about Boozy now, right? Like it's not like he's some guy who's like making big hits and is on the side like delivering commentary on his view about, the place of gay people in black culture, right? He's probably primarily known these days as a commentator, and certainly one who's out of step seemingly with the genre and certainly with the culture at large.
You know, you mentioned that period of time with Biggie and Tupac, and you had a mainstream, I guess, skepticism towards rap for the issues that you had just described. But even internally, that was like a real schism within rap, that specific time, like the underground East Coast purist versus the mafioso, Big Willie, like the flossy rappers. That I don't know that that's happened necessarily in rap since. That was really, really intense. And a lot of times I can't even go back and really listen to like De La Soul's album from that period because I'm like, it's so consumed by other rap.
It's so, I mean,
this being part of the culture or not, etc. I'm like, I'm deeply uninterested in that debate now.
Well, it's funny, like, it's funny now to think of how prominent that was. I mean, I always think about that DJ Shadow track, Why Hip Hop Sucks in 96. Remember? And the answer, as you guys both know, was, it's the money. Right? And you look back and you think, like, well, first of all, it's kind of weird to complain about rappers making too much money. Right? That's an odd critique, especially given the lives that a lot of hip-hop stars have led. The idea that I'm going to, like, begrudge Wu-Tang Clan making a few $1 million off of rap music is nuts. Even the idea that I'm going to begrudge Sean Combs making a bunch of money off of hip-hop, like, seems weird. And then the other thing that seems weird, of course, is the idea that hip-hop sucked in 1996. Like, you're kind of like, I don't know what you go back and you try to think like, well, what records came out in 96? And, you think of maybe ATLiens as 96, right? Like there's a bunch of really good records coming out then. And so that split, in retrospect, a lot of those splits end up seeming weird. You can do that with country music, right? You can do that and you can look at the outlaw country movement of the 70s and say like country music is terrible, right? And then other people go back and look at the quote unquote mainstream music of the country music of the 70s and they're like, "Oh, no, there were some some great songs." And it's fine that people it's fine that Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson and these people were doing this outlaw country music and they didn't want to use string sections on their records, but like there's a bunch of great country music with string sections on them too. You see that with neo soul, right? The idea that like there's something wrong with R&B in the mid to late 90s. And so, Erykah Badu and D'Angelo and Maxwell are going to come along and they're going to do something that's like live instruments instead of like computer beats, and it's going to be songs about love instead of like songs about hooking up in the club, and it's going to be kind of like 70s feeling instead of futuristic. And that seems kind of odd because you go back now and you're like, well, there's no reason you can't listen to D'Angelo and enjoy Aaliyah or whatever was epitomizing sort of futuristic R&B of the mid to late 90s. So yeah, you don't see some of those divides fade over time, but again, others of them don't. I was talking to someone, a dance music obsessive recently, and thinking about how that divide is really alive and well in dance music. Like if you're even now, if you're a house music head or like you're deep into techno or whatever, so underground dance music, you're probably like not that excited about the mainstream, like big room European dance music tracks, right? There still is a lot of that skepticism of sort of mainstreamism in the world of dance music. And I suspect that's because dance music is so social that if you're going to go out and listen to a DJ set for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, like part of what you're doing is like you're choosing what bar you want to go to. And
also fashion, right? Like
but both of those. And so you're like, well, what kind of people do I want to spend my night with tonight? And right. I want them to be, and you might think like, I want them to be cool. I don't want them to be like a bunch of bros jumping up and down. And so, some of that spirit is still alive in dance music. But again, I think it's inevitable, right? There's no way to love music without forming judgments about like what's cool and what's not cool. So,
I was going to say basketball has these same sort of periodic like existential crises. And if you go back to the early 2000s, people were bemoaning that the game did not look like the 80s, that it wasn't free-flowing and passing, and it was all iso ball and defensive struggles, and no one would push the ball down the court or anything like that. They just would milk the clock. No one scored. And then now you have people saying, well, this isn't like it was back in the day. Everybody's shooting threes. Everybody's running too much. this is just how it always goes with everything every single time. People just start lionizing what they liked in high school, and they do that for the rest of their lives.
But one of the weird things that happened in basketball, as far as I can tell from an outsider, is that like it got cool. Like the culture of basketball is a lot cooler than like the culture of professional football, right? Which is like a much normier culture.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that is deeply entrenched in rap music and the kind of exciting culture that was kind of, I mean, it runs parallel to the come up of like these great musicians, right? And how they're all tied to the culture of the NBA game. 1996, I just had to Google it. The year Introducing came out by DJ Shadow. What a year in rap music. Iron
We're
Man.
We're fact-checking DJ Shadow live on the air here.
Hells yeah, E40. It's called Google. Look it up. Busta Rhymes
Reasonable
Becoming.
Doubt.
MOP.
How would I go
written.
about looking up Google, by the way? What's the best way to do that?
Isn't Google just the internet? It's just like,
So I could Google it?
yeah. Outkast, Tupac, Reasonable Doubt, Stakes is High, Muddy Waters. Crazy year in rap music. Okay.
It was
So
written.
you had Allen Iverson got drafted that year. These
It was
things
the
are
start of the NBA.
parallel pathing.
Yeah. Who would fight Ben? We had this debate last night. Who would be the next Verzuz? Who'd you pick out? It was Busta Rhymes.
When you
versus
presented Busta,
Yeah.
you said Busta is one of the verse. He
Yeah, but
needs someone
against
to
who?
verses against him. I thought Method Man was a reasonable
No!
counterpoint.
He's got
No,
too
no.
You say
many-
no.
No.
Okay, go on.
He's got
Why?
because when you start to look for like Method Man hits,
Mary J.
yeah, you got You're All I Need. You got one or two songs with Redman. You got some Wu-Tang tracks. But like Busta has done so many features and had so many hits. He doesn't have front to back albums. Like that's his weak spot. But he's got a lot of records, and now that Verzuz has kind of morphed into more of a performance, and especially with hip hop, it's like an actual show.
Yeah.
You'd need someone that could put on a show. I would match Busta with his old Elektra Records label mate Missy Elliott.
Wow. I was there that summer for both those records. It's crazy. But
I like that competition. I think they're
Missy
similar
is a much
in
more-
many ways.
I think Missy is much like I'd much rather listen to Missy. I think she's a much more important figure in hip hop, and her albums are much better. But if they're going song for song, and Busta Rhymes being a much more dynamic performer, I would love Busta versus Missy. I think Missy has said she doesn't want to do a versus, maybe. Although
she would destroy Busta, right? Like she has blockbuster hits. But to your point, the performance.
Yeah, her hits some of them are a little more subtle, a little more sly. Like everyone loses their mind right when she does, when she does Work It or Get Your Freak On. But even by the time you get into I Can't Stand the Rain and some of those records, like the performance is maybe a little bit laid back, whereas you've got like Busta Rhymes jumping up and down, and even some of his, less world dominating hits, like when he does Pass the Crevassier, like that's a big moment. So I
But are we talking about a theoretical Busta or the actual one that is like enormous and probably can't move?
No. Busta still brings it. I would suspect
Can he do
Busta on a stage, yes. I think he would
VMAs
still
was recent,
bring
right?
the energy. And I mean, this is maybe I'm too influenced by like going to a lot of rap shows in the 2000s when I was working at the New York Times, and like every time I feel like I saw Busta Rhymes do Pass the Crevassier like a dozen times at different shows, and like every time Busta Rhymes got on the stage, like you were never unhappy to see him. You were like, here it comes.
Yeah. What if Busta Rhymes got up in the verses and just did lines from Finding Forrester, which he was in? So he just got up there and he was just like, "You're the man now, dog." Would that work? Would that win him some street cred?
Hearing him say "You're the man now, dog," especially if he did it in his best Sean Connery voice, I think everyone would be happy about that. I mean, it's weird. The versus thing is interesting because it starts as this pandemic thing, and it seems like it wants to be, or it's morphing into something that's more like maybe a tour. and
For
like,
sure, they could take this on the road for sure.
Yeah, and have you pair two artists, or you do a series of pairings, and it's also it's interesting that it's coming closer to the you could see, I don't know if the people would be upset if the stage banter was the same night to night, or if people would feel like they had to switch it up. I always thought Verzuz was going to go, it stuck more hip hop than I thought it was going to go, because there was a moment, especially during the pandemic, where it was so big, where I was like, yo, man, let's do Damon Albarn versus the Gallaghers. Like, what are we doing?
Oh,
like,
my God, that would be incredible.
Like, Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney are still alive. Like,
how?
I don't know. It seemed like there was. It seemed like it could be that at a moment, and it wasn't quite that. But it was fun to think about what that would, if you got like fully outside of hip hop and just like found big figures from popular culture.
Yo, Dipset won that. Come on.
They tried less. They won.
Yes.
I mean, I really enjoyed some of the earlier ones where they were kind of telling stories about the songs, and they'd like rap along with each other, and it was not actually competitive, despite the title being.
Did Gucci take it to the next level?
Well, yeah,
he threatened somebody.
He made him dig his mans up.
Oh my God, so brutal.
That was the feeling I got during Gucci Mane Young Jeezy versus. Was not a feeling I've gotten really from any of the other verses. That feeling of like I think I might have started to sweat during that one. It might have been the only one where I was like, oh, I'm feeling a little clammy. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I don't know for sure if this is going to end well. And sometimes you see that, people, when Bounty Killer and Beanie Man got together, I think people didn't know what way that was going to go, and that ended up being like a total feel-good moment.
Sure.
With a cameo by the Police, if I recall correctly. So yes, it is that.
Joel Embiid showed up. Oh,
an actual cop.
Yeah. Well, speaking of actual cops,
Were we?
Speaking of maybe cops, Pete Wells did an 11 Madison Park takedown. And Kay, I know you have dining thoughts. You're up to date. Like Boozy is with certain topics on the dining scene.
Well, sort of, right? Like, on the one hand, yes, my wife owns a restaurant called Pies and Thighs.
A great restaurant, yeah.
But on the other hand, like, I had 2 kids. There's been a pandemic. I can't claim to frequently patronize the city's various restaurants, except in a sort of like quick takeout capacity.
Right. Well, I mean, you're caught up with the whole 11 Madison takedown. I assume. It's kind of hilarious. What's up with this beef room? We have new intel.
I got some intel. So I was speaking
we got
with
some
one
breaking
of my friends.
news here.
Yeah.
Your number one source, Cookies, is your number one source for book promotion and breaking news from the restaurant world.
Yeah.
As everyone knows, that's our wheelhouse. And so I was told that when you have a restaurant that's the status of EMP, it's not that these private dining rooms are even more exclusive, because the place is fucking exclusive. It's one of those exclusive restaurants in the world. These are places that were rented out for like a wedding dinner or an anniversary group. They are private dining rooms that were booked potentially years ago and then were not used during the pandemic. So people have paid for these rooms and paid for a menu that was available at that time. Mm-hmm. So that's why they go up until the end of this year. That's when they're stopping the secret beef room, because they've sold these years ago. Oh, and you can't say...
You're saying they sold tickets to the
Yep.
secret beef room before they went vegan.
Yes, and they can't say, oh yeah, you paid us this exorbitant amount of money, but we're going to get rid of the steak. And people will be like, well, no, we paid for this specific menu. We helped pick the menu that was going to be in that room on this date for our wedding anniversary and with our loved ones, or after, this business meeting or whatever it may be. But that's why it still exists. It's not actually hypocrisy. It's just kind of the vestigial remnants of their own private dining booking. That's all. But Ben,
I think we should.
But Pete Wells knew this too, and still used it as a kicker. Respect.
Wow.
Well, because we are all extremely serious journalists here, I think I'd be remiss if we didn't disclose the fact that the Cookies release party for Joy of Basketball is going to be in the beef room, right? That's how you learn this.
That's right.
So, and you booked this, you booked that release party years ago. I think your only request...
And then the supply chain messed up the
and your
paper,
only request to the staff at 11 Madison Park, if I recall correctly, was we want plenty of beef at our book release party. And so now...
Whole pig.
Yeah. They'd be in breach of contract if they were to switch that up now. So, yes, you're speaking from experience here.
But isn't it crazy to think of... I think of 11 Madison as like a lot of entertainment value, not only with the food. Like when you go to 11 Madison, you're just like, the service was amazing, the ambiance was cool, there's a Rita Ackerman painting in front of my grill, and it speaks to me as like an experience one would have like going to a music show or going to hear a DJ. And isn't this kind of like shut up and play the hits a little bit? It's like, why? Okay, you bought this reservation to get this slab of beef, and then they just switch it up and be like, yo, we're not doing beef anymore. It's sort of like going to see a band play new songs, right?
Right.
Like, aren't you just subjective to whatever the hell Daniel Hum wants to do?
Well, but there's different
in this situation, what I've been told is no, because you've picked the menu, you've agreed on the menu, and that's part of the process of renting out this space.
But also, there's different kinds of bands.
I just think this explanation makes sense to me.
Oh,
like
for
your
sure,
point,
for sure.
maybe he says, you know what? We're actually not going to serve you beef because we're vegetarian now. And people say, cool, we're canceling it then. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But
this
it
is
is just like...
But this is the music
it was
parallel,
agreed
right?
upon.
Like, there's bands where if you go see them, like, you might not hear the hits. Like, there's bands where that, like, whatever they feel like tonight is whatever you're going to get, and who knows, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's bands that, like most bands, that want to maintain a stable touring audience, and, like, they want to give the people a show, and if you go see Billy Joel, or he's not gonna just do like solo no vocals piano for an hour and a half. He's gonna like play the songs people want, and maybe he's not gonna get to every single song that everyone wants, but he's gonna find a way to send people home happy, and like that's his business model. So I'm not sure that. And I wouldn't say that like, oh, Billy Joel should be a different kind of performer. The question is like what kind of performer you want to be, what kind of restaurant you want to be, right? And like. Yes, like 11 Madison Park is vegan, but it's not Superiority Burger, right? It's not Brooks being like, no, this is like his version of integrity is like, no, I'm going to serve you like what I feel like serving you, and like it's going to be delicious and you're going to be happy to take it, right? 11 Madison Park, I think, as Ben says, probably for the business model needs to be a little more customer friendly than that, and probably needs to have a little less fuck you in the mix. I think a different kind of restaurant could be like, yeah, we've changed since you made your reservation. Have a seat and shut up.
Right.
And I think part of this is also that they were shut for a long time during the pandemic. So people paid them this money for these things. So to return that money and say, okay, we're going to put someone else into that place. Maybe they could, but I don't think they want to give back money that people have already given them.
But isn't this also a thing about veganism, right? Like I was vegan for a bunch of years, and the thing about veganism is can you make it so that it feels luxurious? In other words, so that if you were eating at 11 Madison Park and you were eating the vegan menu and you found out that someone had a prearranged beef room extravaganza happening that night, like, could you make it so that you didn't feel like you were missing out? That you felt like the thing that you were doing was just as luxurious and you didn't envy the beef room people at all. And in fact, you were like, well, they're really missing out on these delicious vegetables that we're eating, right? Like, that's part of the question.
Okay, you have to tell us. You were the one who was vegan for a few years. Did it ever feel luxurious?
I've got to say that at the time I was vegan, there wasn't much about my life that felt luxurious. A lot of my friends.
Zen Palette every night.
Well, no, Zen Palette would have seemed luxurious. I remember moving to New York and, Zen Palette, and even not that it was split. In the old days at Chinatown, there was House of Vegetarian. I remember in Boston, where I was living during most of my vegan years, there was Buddha's Delight, which was a vegetarian spot in Boston's Chinatown. And yeah, it was like falafel and French fries and like whatever we get from the local health food store. So I wasn't like, I wasn't going out to fancy restaurants and having any sort of fancy vegan experience. And a lot of my friends were vegan or vegetarian. A lot of my friends were straight edge or straight edge-ish. So it just wasn't, it wasn't something that really like set me apart from my peers. If anything, it was like part of the social scene that I was in. And at the time, like I said, I was not particularly interested in luxury, nor was there much luxury that was available to me.
Yeah, and I feel
I
like
think the first. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
no, you go off.
Oh, I was just gonna say. The first restaurant I think I went to in New York City was Vegetarian Paradise 2, VP2, right by the
Vegetarian
cage.
Paradises. Yeah, man. I mean, Daniel Hum is trying to have it both ways, right? And he got hand slapped a little bit because what he's doing is essentially like a political statement, right? And the food is kind of secondary to his message. And I have no problems with this message. I think it's pretty cool. But then here comes the hypocrisy police, right? And Pete Wells kind of uncovers this thing that we can get him for without disclosing a kind of a procedural fact that Ben has let everyone know about that makes total sense and is kind of a business decision, and it's almost holding up an end of a bargain, which we all think is ethical. But like Pete Wells is doing a thing and Daniel Hum is doing a thing, and they're both kind of like right and wrong at the same time, right?
But isn't the assumption kind of baked into your question? Like the question of like whether the food is, as you put it, secondary to the ethical project that he's committed to. I mean, isn't the whole point that if he's doing it right, the food won't feel like it's secondary to that project?
Doing it right is a sliding scale, right? Like Pete Wells was not convinced. I've heard some people say great things. I love reviews. I enjoy people with ideas about things, but like I get that Pete Wells was put off by it. But I met a couple people who were delighted by that menu.
Well, I have a couple more gems here, just to share from my source.
Drop them
my
on
source.
You got some more jewels. Wow, this is some shoe leather reporting like the old days.
I got
muckraking.
Jules Infinite Son. So my friend says that one, he believes Daniel Hume's Hume, I believe it's Hume, heart is pure, that he genuinely wants to be the change that he hopes to see in the world, and that vegetables, counter to what Pete Wells said, are actually often more expensive than meat. He's like, vegetables, when you were getting the really good stuff, that Natura hit, he said they're really, really, really expensive. So he pushed back on a couple of those points, not only the beef room, but the idea that it was performative, virtue signaling, and also that it was even a cost-effective strategy. So all in all...
Can we refer to your secret source by the code name Schmanuel Schmoom?
Yes.
Manuel.
But like that's not our fault that he buys expensive vegetables, right? That's not a causational thing. That's just like a correlation, right?
Well, Wells did make kind of an accusation within that review that it was a financial decision, or at least was part of it.
But doesn't all this just revolve around this simple question of deliciousness, where like, if someone goes there and finds the food delicious, like none of this stuff will matter that much. And if someone goes there and their mind isn't blown by how delicious the food is, then all of this stuff is going to loom larger, right?
This is like a guilty pleasure discussion, right?
And my source said that the food isn't good, that he tried to do something inventive and misfired.
Your source
takeaway is kind of
your source is more interesting.
Schmanuel Schmoom is gone on record criticizing Daniel Hume. This is big news.
So yeah, Cookie's release party in the beef room with Isaiah Stewart, aka Beef Stew, holding it down as our MC. It's gonna be great.
I mean, I think I don't mean to tell you how to do your job as muckraking podcasters, but it sounds to me like Ben buried the lead here, as we say in the news business.
Wow.
Because what you're saying, Ben, is that your source is saying that the chef, Daniel Hume, realizes that his food is not as delicious as it should be? Is that what you're saying?
No. He was just saying that the food is not that good, but that Hume's heart is in the right place here, and it's
But
not
even
an
that-
economic decision.
but even that-
and the beef room is not hypocrisy. He just did not make good vegetables.
But if it's the case that Hume is cooking food that people close to him, apparently, like your source, that people close to him do not feel is delicious, then that suggests that at least somewhere in the inner circle of 11 Madison Park, there are people who think that what they're doing isn't really working, which suggests to me that this experiment might not last that long. Am I wrong to draw that inference from your exclusive, you heard it here first reporting?
I can't say if the source is
Wow,
in that
Jesus.
inner sanctum or not.
Jesus.
You know, I just,
all of a
deep
sudden,
background.
Ben's source is like not quite so well placed as many of us thought 10 minutes ago. This is interesting.
Very informed, but
I
on
see.
deep background.
None of this happens without the pandemic, right? Like this menu does not change without. Actually, the divorce at 11 Madison was happening pre-pandemic, maybe that was in the works. But my question is like, are we like are we overcompensating after like this disastrous couple years? Like, are we taking these stances like Pete Wells does in his writing, not kind of talking about like the emotional impact of what this 2 years has been? Like, are we just like not really talking about the box and we're just talking about the thing within the box? Like, does this political move happen in this restaurant without everything that's happened? Of course, I'm talking about the pitchfork revisionist kind of drop that they did, right? They reassigned the number of values of a lot of their records in previous years to adapt to today's climate.
Which is something that you see, if you're like super nerdy about record reviews, this has become like kind of a sport, which is whenever a publication drops a new list of like 100 greatest records of all time or whatever, like I think Rolling Stone recently did one, you can chart how different artists move up and down in esteem over the years. Which is interesting and which is, I could imagine a world where if you're going to review records, you could revisit them as often as you want and, just leave the old score up with the date and be like, in this year it was scored this, and that year it was scored that, and this year it was scored...
It's like stats, right?
Yes, and you'd be constantly reevaluating. The thing that makes me nervous is when people erase or, try to disappear those old reviews or update them without noting it. That's one way in which... That's one way in which like physical books can be really helpful, right? It's fascinating to get the old like Rolling Stone Guide to Rock, and they're talking about like how like Bruce Springsteen is like kind of not that cool. And it's it's 1980 or whatever. Like that's really interesting and precisely because it hasn't changed since then. Because I think you get useful information by knowing how people think of a record now, but you also get useful information by knowing how it was seen at the time. I talk in my book about this idea that Prince, about the discourse about whether Prince was kind of a sellout in the 80s. And like that sounds insane now. Like that's not
I'm no Prince stan. Like speak.
That's not a think piece you read in 2021 of like, was Prince a sellout? But there was this idea that like, oh, is it disturbing that Prince and Michael Jackson, the two big crossover R&B stars of the 80s, people were writing about how like, well, they both seem kind of effeminate. Does that mean that it's harder for a quote unquote real masculine black man to cross over to white audiences? Nelson George, the great critic, wrote about this in his book, The Death of Rhythm and Blues, and talks about how, Prince has a white actress playing his mother in Purple Rain, whereas in fact, like his mother was black. And does this mean that he's, catering to a white audience this way? Even the fact that he's like an incredible electric guitar player, is that a way to get rock listeners to listen to this R&B music by saying like, no, it's like sort of rock and roll? Same with the guitar solo in Beat It by Michael Jackson. So like those old debates are not the debates we have now, but it's like, it's informative to know that was the climate when those records came out.
Well, there was a basketball, I guess, draft prognosticator. I think it was Chris Ford. Andrew follows that stuff more than I do. But he was retroactively going back and changing his draft grades for prospects, which defeats the entire purpose, obviously, other than the purpose saying, I was right about this guy. Because
Isn't
when
this
we
a-
were writing this
isn't
Joy
this
of
a big
Basketball,
thing with-
I found that really helpful to find what people thought about players, right or wrong, when they were, 18, 19 years old. Back in, I don't know, here's the scouting report for someone who came to the league in 1993. And I find that stuff really helpful and interesting, but changing it retroactively defeats the whole purpose.
Well, and this is an even bigger deal when it comes to people that offer or even sell their betting picks, right?
Yeah.
And because you can
Right,
buy. You can buy like the cheat sheet that'll allegedly help you beat the spread, betting NFL or whatever. And like for there, it's like a real money at stake in the question of is the archive of this person's past hits and is picks, is that correct? And do we have good data for how they have historically done against the spread, right? And the sort of related question of like, if you're that good at picking against the spread, like, can't you make all your money that way instead of selling your picks? Right. But yes, that's always, that's a fascinating question. Like how prescient were you really? And that's part of I've as someone who's written about music for a lot of years. Like one of the parts that's not so much fun is like when you say something that everyone thinks is stupid years later or even at the time, right? Like I had a headline of mine go viral.
Which one?
The Beyonce, she's no Ashanti.
I love the take. I love
a headline I did
remember
not
that.
write.
I saw this. I saw it going viral
Yeah.
as well. I remember this. Yeah.
It pops up on Twitter. It still pops up on Twitter sometimes. And sometimes when headlines go viral on Twitter, they crop out the byline. And in this case, I can report to you they do not crop out the byline. So that's my name.
I saw it and I saw it and I laughed for sure. I was just like, okay.
I mean, it's spread so widely that by now, I mean, I assume that Ashanti probably saw it when it came out. I assume she's seen it often since. And yes, I do issue an official mea culpa in the book, but also try to explain. But that's also like part of the risks of doing anything like that. Like you mentioned, I mean, I think it might be a little bit different in sports. Because if there was someone that was actually eerily accurate in predicting how this or that draft prospect was going to perform in the NBA, you would super want to read that. And in music,
that's what we
if there
call
was
the
someone,
Andrew Kuo big board.
It's called the KBB for short. Yeah.
And in music, if there was someone who was like really good at predicting like which unsigned artist was going to be huge, like you might be interested in reading that. But part of the reason often why you read someone writing, especially writing longer things about music, is that they're going to disagree with the conventional wisdom.
Yes,
and they're going to have a take that's different from what everyone else is thinking. Like, it's not that interesting if someone's just like, if someone's taking whatever record is huge and being like, or whatever record is critically acclaimed and being like, yeah, it's awesome. And so for anyone who's writing about music in particular, I think part of the goal is to find a balance between like, not sounding like you're out of your mind, but also not just sounding like you're kind of boring and you're just like parroting the conventional wisdom on anything. And so it means like you want to be quote unquote right, some or much of the time, but it also helps to be willing to write things that are perceived as wrong.
Yeah, I always say in sports, like, being wrong is baked into being right. It's like you can't have one without the other. I've never seen anyone been wrong every single time. Like sometimes they're just right by accident. And that's kind of my point regarding the Pete Wells beef room kind of thing. It's just like sometimes I find myself forgetting that writing is also independent of the object. Like there's the reason I love your book so much is it's like secretly personal. It was secretly personal and emotional, right? And we've been talking about all these 7 things and about like the architecture of how we talk about music. But the book has jokes. It's funny. It's about your life and your experience on planet Earth, right? And I always want to remind myself, like with Pitchfork reviews, with Chad Ford's draft guide or whatever, like there's biases here that make it interesting. And it becomes a stat in itself. Like we start keeping track of like the wins and losses of a scout, of a GM, and there's this thing like that people bristle at when people root for suits instead of players on the court. But like those GMs who run teams are as fascinating as someone who shoots shots, in my opinion. And the package is just different. And I love the revisionist kind of history of people changing their mind and going back. It's like, because then it turns into like the life of Pablo, right? Like an artwork. It's like if you go and listen to Kanye's iTunes Pablo, it's probably different than what you remembered. I find a freedom there.
What I was kind of thinking of along these lines is that as someone who wrote about music years ago in the era when there were still like 5 mics or 5 stars or the Pitchfork scale of 10, that era kind of just evaporated and no one cared about what a critic assigned a particular album or a song in a numeric sense or via avatars that add up to 5. But
Likes.
for some reason right now, there's part of it was Pitchfork, like revisiting those things. But I've also seen other people kind of talking about number reviews a little bit lately. Like a mild uptick after years of no one really talking about number reviews. Are we going back to it? Do we want stars? Do we want numbers?
There were some places. Was it Eater that actually like suspended its starred review system because of the pandemic?
Oh,
New York Times.
Yeah, New York Times.
New York Times did that too, right? Yeah.
I think that's smart. I love the star reviews. I love a number. Come on, let's go. Like, talk about this in numerous ways, right?
Yeah,
I just felt like it had totally vanished for like 7-8 years. No one talked about a number, a Pitchfork review, nothing. And then all of a sudden, they're popping up again.
Well, this has something to do with the changing way we think about consensus. Like in the old days of the internet, the way to be successful was to maybe go viral by departing from the consensus, right? And the idea was like the internet was full of like maniacs and contrarian takes and people just writing the craziest shit they could just to try and get attention, right? And then with social media, it kind of like swings the other way. And like there are big, even or especially if you do this for a living, there are incentives to avoid departing too sharply from the consensus, right? Even if it doesn't mean, not that you'll necessarily get fired, but you might not want to face like an army of angry BTS fans or whoever is going to be
haters.
Ben Simmons haters. Yeah, whoever's gonna. And so you do see a lot of. It becomes like a high wire act where you see people wanting to maybe not violate consensus too completely and sometimes maybe make smaller points to differentiate themselves by the competition, right? From the competition, right? This is like one of the confusing things about the takes economy, both in sports and in music, I think, is that, the goal is to somehow have a take that's like sort of different from everyone else's take, but like sort of the same as everyone else's take. And sometimes that can just mean like the take that works the best is the take that's like sort of what everyone else is saying, but done more forcefully or in a way that sounds surprising, but the content isn't really. And, I think that asks the broader question of what it is that we want from takes and to what extent we want those takes to be wrong sometimes.
It reminds me of Gladwell's piece being like, maybe I don't find Norm Macdonald that funny. Maybe he's not for me. And I'm like, well, yeah, totally. He's not for everyone. It was almost a correction to something that I think we all noticed. It was like, did everyone really love Norm Macdonald this much? Are we scared of death? Or is he like one of the great, great comedians of our life? Like, I had not considered him as an all-time great. I loved him. But the framing of him was so profound. And he was such a unique comic where he was offensive, he was awkward. He really embraced that Gen X energy, right? Of just like, well, I'm a loser, why don't you kill me?
What Gladwell wrote about him, and I think the first edition of his like new newsletter, he wrote like, I never got Norm Macdonald, but he was kind of like, but I'm not like deep into comedy. So like, I think I understand why people who are deep into comedy like it, but you shouldn't pay attention to the fact that I don't like it because I'm not deep in that world. And like some of my favorite Malcolm Gladwell things, it was interesting to me because it was also paradoxical, right? He was telling us like, don't pay attention to my view of Norm Macdonald. But I actually found it kind of interesting and useful to hear what Norm Macdonald sounded like to someone who didn't find him funny. and didn't and like that. I'm a fan of Norm Macdonald. I think he's great. I think he's
Hell yeah.
fascinating. I think he's interesting. I think he's really funny. I always loved his from the Weekend Update era.
Dirty
On. So, and I think sometimes we underestimate the value of hearing someone from outside of the world of people who appreciate the thing saying like, here's what this thing seems like to someone who doesn't care that much about it and sort of doesn't get it. And that can be it can be kind of a reality check in a way sometimes.
I have not heard a better segue in my entire damn podcasting life, because now I want to ask UK about your experience with the Philadelphia Process Sixers. Talking about an outsider.
I have very limited experience because there's a time when I thought I was going to write a piece about the process. Do you have a sound effect that you play when people say the process on this show?
Is it like a kazoo?
You guys don't have any sound effects, do you? That's what I'm realizing.
In post, Andrew just makes a lot of interesting noises, and then we edit them in all over the place. Birds,
But like
lions, roaring cats.
But at the time, I can't remember exactly when this was. At the time, like the process was this thing that all the like super well-informed basketball people were talking about, and like people outside of basketball
Can you give us a
weren't
year?
really paying
Like-
much attention to it.
Like, can you frame? I remember when you were going down to Philly mysteriously all the time, and this was in the beginning of the process, the actual process.
I went to a few different games, and I went to. I'm trying to look it up now, like when that was. I remember at least for one of them, I took the. Here it is. So it was like late 2014, maybe some early 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going down there, I think maybe on the train, and like taking the subway down to the arena. And like those games I'd never seen an arena that empty for a basketball game. And like just the fact that you're in this weird complex with all these sporting arenas, like in January, you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, even though you're like in Philadelphia at the basketball game. So that was, as someone who's used to going to Knicks games where like it's always full, like kind of no matter what. And it's always expensive. The idea that you could just like wander in and for, I don't know, were the cheapest tickets like $5 or $10 or something?
Wow.
You just wander into like an empty arena and watch a basketball game. It was fascinating. And yeah, I never got, the piece didn't end up happening. So I didn't get that much further than like watching a few games and maybe asking a few questions in locker rooms or press conferences or something. But it was fascinating to be there and to see that this thing was happening and to try to figure out, again, this was part of my interest, was like the outside view. Like, what does this strange process look to the outsider, and not the complicated questions of like, well, does this work and how sure that can you be about drafting well, but like the more basic question of like what is a basketball team for? And like, okay, it exists to entertain the fans, but like how much entertainment do you assign to like winning the championship years down the line versus how much entertainment value can you assign to just like being able to watch a competitive game with a halfway decent team on a random January night? And how much entertainment do you even assign to the fact that like you have the old-fashioned experience of rooting for the team to win instead of having to have this weird postmodern experience of rooting for the team to lose?
Yeah.
Well, there's also the irony here, specifically with Philadelphia, who was a number 1 seed last year, and their fans are miserable, deeply, deeply unhappy, unenthusiastic about the season. Like, you had the best record in the Eastern Conference, and people are saying, well, the process, I guess, wasn't worth it. All that losing for this? I'm like, no, it was a success. You got to be number 1 seed. You have 2, young superstars, but there's this constant relitigation of the process, even now, when the team is good. So to what you were talking about, that period of time, there were certainly fans like myself who said, this makes sense to me as a rebuilding method, a process, if you will. This checks out, and this is how I would go about doing it, and maybe it'll work. And you also had a huge percentage of the basketball world that was scandalized by a team that wasn't making at least even a bad faith effort at pretending as if they were winning, trying to win games, that they had any interest in being competitive. And
Well, isn't this
so Sam
this
Hinkie.
is the yeah?
Oh, I was going to say, so Sam Hinkie is still a polarizing figure just because of the perception of the process from back then, even today.
Right. But I was saying this is like a complicated question, right? Because it seems to me that if you're watching basketball, you have to. It's much more pleasurable if you believe that the players want nothing more than to win the championship and they're doing everything they can to do that, right? Like that helps give it coherence and give it meaning. But then the secondary question is, but then obviously the fact is that like as a fan, the enjoyment that you have, a lot of it comes from like going to a game day in, day out and like rooting on the team. It's not as if you can somehow compress all that joy into like the night they win the championship. Like, in other words, so you have to be, you want to perceive that the team is striving toward that, but most of basketball is the journey, not the destination, right? Most of the fun you get is like the stuff that happens along the way.
Yeah. And your fascination with it, to me at the time, made so much sense, right? Because it felt like something was happening. It's like, okay, down in Philly, they're doubling up on drum beats and putting reggae samples over it. And it's kind of raga. And like, I need to go down and see this for myself.
That's right.
This sounds amazing. And it's just like within the context, this normie concept of like people trying to like be relevant in the NBA. There's something going on in Philly that's thrilling, right?
Right.
And it could work, it could not work, but it's something we should all take note of. And it reminded me of a subculture in music or in art or a movement that kind of like explodes. And the end result is always kind of subjective. And I agree with Ben. It's a resounding success. This team is excellent. And
Well, but also the idea of rebuilding through the draft has been part of all sports for a long time since drafts have existed. Like, we're going to be bad this year. We're going to play some young guys. Hopefully some of them will pan out. We'll be lousy. We'll get a new guy who coming in who has more talent than our, exiting veterans, and we'll take it from there. And I think it was really just because Boston was involved in the tanking that season that the Sixers became, as a traditional rival to Boston, a symbol of how not to tank versus what the Celtics were doing, which was how you properly tank. And like, I really do think it was Boston media, the Sixers and Celtics, both sort of competing in a perverse way for, the best talent out of the upcoming draft. And I think that's where a lot of the fire and brimstone directed towards Sam Hinkie and the Sixers came from. It was just
as someone
Boston
who grew up
wasn't
mainly
as bad as them.
Well, as someone who grew up mainly in Boston, I like any story where Boston gets to be the villain. Boston, my theory is that Boston used to be unanimously the most hated city in America up through sometime in the mid to late 2000s when the baton was passed to San Francisco.
I was going to say New Orleans, but
no one hates some people don't hate New Orleans.
Okay, fair,
by and large. People don't sneer at New Orleans like it's obvious that everyone else hates it too. Like
True.
But I think that, but again, I want to go back to this question of pleasure. This is something I think about a lot, obviously, with music. It's something I think about a lot with boxing. Like that question of like, what's the point of this? Like the point of this is to make me happy, right? Like that's the point of basketball, is to like give you pleasure. And so the question of like how important winning is to that is actually a pretty profound and hard to answer question. Like if I ask you, Quo, like about your love for the Knicks and how much that has to do with how many games they win or lose, or how much extra pleasure you get from every extra game they win in a season, like it's kind of hard to answer, right?
It's on the face, it's easy, and then it gets so complicated. And me and Ben wrote a book about this, and I don't know if we came to a distinct conclusion, but I always say there is no way I could love this Knicks team more than I do. Like, I love them with all my heart, right? If they win the championship, I'll be thrilled. I'll be blowing up both your cell phones. I'll be standing next to you guys, jumping up and down. But if they lose, like, I just love this team. But it's just like a different form of pleasure is what you're talking about. And like, this goes back to 11 Madison. This goes back to the way we think about music. And like, don't some fans of these things want to be right, and don't they derive pleasure from being correct or ethical or somehow politically aligned to their belief system? Because I believe a lot of stuff, but I don't believe a lot of stuff. So the idea of pleasure to me is very visceral. Like, it's like a feeling I have in my body, but like, it's not informed by like being right, because being right is kind of a fool's errand, right?
I've never found rooting for a bad team to be challenging at all. I always, it's kind of fun. You know, you get to sort of acquaint yourself with young guys and cast-offs who you can
it's fun. Covington,
mentally project as becoming great players, even though they're in China within a year and a half.
Easy.
This guy, this guy, Jakar Sampson, I'm telling you, man, he's the next Kawhi Leonard. Like, that stuff is really fun and really easy. And when they lose, you say, okay, cool, we're going to get a better lottery pick. And when they win, you say, oh, I wasn't expecting that. Glad these guys pulled that one out. I find it so easy.
But isn't that the paradox here, that rooting for a team, part of what it means to root for a team is that you want them to win and you want them to be better. Even as, having thought about this a lot, you know that if they were better, you wouldn't necessarily love them any more than you do now.
I mean, it could backfire, right, with, Boston with the Red Sox or Chicago with the Cubs. You know, their identity was so steeped in being lovable losers. Charlie Brown, right? Like this old boomer idea, Gen X even. And then when they win, like Boston has won so much that they have shifted that entire narrative to them being excellent. But Chicago, the Cubs, I would say, like, was that like a vibe betrayal? Like, where do you go from here? When you become rich, you no longer have to fight to become rich, right? And like, that it's a subjective thing, but like, I don't know what I would be like if I won the lotto. You know,
but isn't it true that it's different for different fans? Like, isn't the actual answer that there is no one answer? There's a guy, Quo, that we both know, who's obsessed with Kansas City teams, and and for him and the way he thinks about sports, like, he wants to win, and so for the Royals to win the World Series, Chiefs to win the Super Bowl, like that retroactively justifies decades of misery. That's way better. That's what he wants. Yeah. But I could imagine for a different kind of Kansas City sports fan, maybe it would have been more fun to root for the Chiefs back when that was, a little more punk, back when that was just this weird little subculture. And now when you walk around and there's all these like bandwagon jumping kids wearing Patrick Mahomes jerseys, like, maybe that's kind of a bummer. Maybe that's actually like less fun in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And this comes back to like the whole, and the fascination with the Sixers in the process. This is all being written in real time, right? Like, all these things that we're talking about are happening in the present with this team, because they're shifting, and a lot's at stake. It's rare to be good enough to be the best in anything. And when you're that close, like, just don't fuck it up. They might be fucking it up. And that is like a tragic kind of story that we all have heard in different forms. And to watch it play out in sports, and to watch a fan base feel like they no longer have pleasure is kind of like, it's kind of melancholy to me.
But you're also someone with a kind of sensibility where you can appreciate the weird fascination and even joy you get from watching someone fuck up, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the bands I liked are not even popular with the weirdos.
Well, and isn't there a musical parallel where, like, there's something about loving music, loving a band, where, like, when you love a song or band, a record, rapper, or whatever, there's part of you that just feels like this is actually objectively good. And even if I'm mature enough to understand that people disagree about music, there is still some part of me that deep down feels like people are wrong not to enjoy this. Like, that
Superchunk is as good as Fugazi.
Yes, and there's some part of you that, and so when that happens, there's some part of you that can't help but hope or expect that eventually, at some point, people will realize that you're right and they're wrong. Which means that, like, even if you're in the most, like, underground scene, when you love a kind of music, there's some part of you that's hoping for its success, even if you know intellectually that success wouldn't necessarily make you love the band even more, and might actually make you less invested in the group, as a lot of, punks found when their favorite bands got big.
Mm-hmm.
But the difference with sports that's kind of funny, though, is that it's the same activity, right? You say, well, I'm a real fan. I've been following them. We're bad. I know the lore. I know who all these guys are. And you're showing up wearing your jersey, and now I can't get a seat at the game. You're not a real fan, but you're also rooting for the same thing. And I feel like like the team didn't sell out; they just got good.
Right.
And you can't even make that like artistic, you know. I mean, I guess you could in some situations. I guess maybe if you were a Golden State fan and they went and they got Kevin Durant, you could say they sold out. They changed.
Yeah,
This isn't the Golden State team that I loved. They whistled the ball around. It was all homegrown guys, and now KD, you know, the second best player in NBA history potentially, just arrives, and all of a sudden he's our guy now. That's not our guy. They added, you know, Eric Clapton to the group. Like this is not Golden State.
But isn't the thing that changes more less who's on the floor and more who's in the stands? Like isn't the true thing that people would be reacting to the feeling that in an earlier era this group of fans felt like a community, and when that group gets bigger it feels less like a community?
And Golden State, it's completely true. I mean, they moved from Oakland to San Francisco. The fan base is totally different. You know, you watch their old games, the demographics have changed. Now it's, you know, incredibly hard to get tickets. It's all tech guys. It's in San Francisco. So these are all actually very valid things that do parallel, I think, music fandom that happened in Golden State over like the last 10 years.
And the paradox is that a group of fans of an unpopular team, that's a community that loves being part of a community, right? Because they're the loyalists. They're the ones who stuck with it when everyone else wouldn't. But they can't help but root that their team would be more successful, even though they know that that means that their community might feel a little less communal.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Bourdain talks about this a lot, right? Like, this is my favorite hole-in-the-wall place, and I've ruined it. So as soon as you see this, it will no longer be my favorite thing, because
Right.
you nerds will go and ruin the whole thing.
Yeah,
It happened to me with 11 Madison Park.
Now everyone's in the meat room. What the hell? But isn't there like kind of a wasn't there sort of like a taboo that was observed, especially in New York journalism, where like you report on restaurants and you report on shows, but you don't really report on bars in the same way?
Interesting. Well,
Because like
I mean,
that's
Ben,
You're talking to me.
Ben used
You're
to do
talking
this
to the
for a
nightlife
living.
writer.
Yeah.
well, but wouldn't there
I
be wouldn't there be
intentionally
spots
kept
you
things
would
on the
report
low,
on?
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And then there became a pressure from my editor to start revealing places early, because New York Magazine might do it or a blog might do it. Like, okay, well, if this little, you know, dim sum parlor is having hot parties, we need to get it out there and you know, get it on the map. And that was antithetical to my approach to kind of hiding things and enjoying them, and then saying, okay, it's incubated long enough for the masses. I'm sick of going here.
Right. I mean,
They didn't want that. They wanted like new. What's the new spot? Get it out there.
I did once spend like 6,000 words snitching on Max Fish in the New Yorker, so it's not.
That's
yes,
right.
I'm aware of this like push and pull, and yes, in doing that, you're kind of like balancing like. Yeah, you're balancing your maybe your affection for a place as a patron with like the story you're trying to tell, and you know what it means. I think, you know, and maybe I wouldn't have done that about a bar that was like newer or felt more fragile or that felt smaller, right? Isn't that part of it? Like the places that you would not want to snitch on are places where it feels really intimate because it's not that many people. And if that's the case, maybe it's actually doesn't need media coverage because maybe it's not actually that significant. Maybe it's just like your local bar.
For sure. And, you know, there aren't that many places like that. So when one would materialize,
Like Madison
it
Square
was
Garden, right?
it was natural to be protective in a way that you aren't when someone opens like a huge music venue like Elsewhere, and you're like, well, sure, I'll write up Elsewhere. It's a massive music venue. It's not someone taking over, you know, again, I'm just using Chinatown as an example because they actually were some, but taking over Red Egg and doing parties there on like, you know, Thursday and Friday nights or something.
It happened to Ghetto Gothic, right? It was hard to pinpoint, even being a part of that scene. Like, okay, they do the party here, but it's moved, and then this crew is doing a separate party, and then kind of I don't know if it got written up, but Rihanna kind of became interested in it, and the whole vibe changed, and it was never the same. But it was awesome to have that moment, and like, yeah, because all these party promoters, these restaurateurs, these teams, they want success, right? Like, please spend 6,000 words and write about us. We want
They
a line
need a
down
certain
the
amount
block.
of success to like stay afloat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you wrote that Max Fish article, everyone there was like psyched because like
Right.
it's so hard to stay open and
Yes.
relevant for decades, right?
And it had
It
been
also
going that
depends on what
long
the,
that
the product is too.
Yeah.
You know, when I wrote about the heads party that Spencer Sweeney was doing, he was like, you can write about it, but you can only write about it after the party ends. He's like, I don't want the dynamic to change here where people are just showing up and all of a sudden we're letting in Joe Blow, who read this article and now wants to draw for free and have some food and have some drinks and hang out in this little environment that they've cultivated. So I think you are always balancing those. But there are definitely people who say, you mean I get to have an article about my party in the New York Times? I know it's some little cool guy shit, but that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's the
Right.
that's the dream. Hell yes.
Does this mean that on this very podcast, Ben, you're about to drop the bomb everyone's been waiting for and announce the collaboration that the world has been waiting for of 11 Madison Square Garden, the
Hell
world's most
yeah.
famous beef room? It's happening, isn't it, Ben? And you have inside knowledge.
You heard it here.
I know some things. I know some things.
Before we go, I want to talk about Kay's my favorite proposal for the NBA. Kay,
Oh,
you
yeah.
you have a way to make the game more universally loved by everyone around the world. Can you talk to
If
us
that's
about
even possible. Well, you know, I'm watching I'm a fight fan, and so in boxing they have, and MMA they have weight classes so that you fight someone your own size, and it shows off the skills of athletes of a wide range of sizes. And it strikes me that in the NBA you get to see the athletic skill of a relatively small segment of humanity, namely tall people or tall-ish people. So my proposal is that since various salary cap kinds of rules are so universally beloved, there could maybe be a height cap. You give each team 6 feet to spend per player, so that's 30 feet, and you can have a maximum of 30 feet on the floor at all times. If you go over that, it's an immediate technical foul. Players, of course, would have their height measured by being
Yes.
gripped by their ankles and hung upside down so that they couldn't slouch to pretend to be shorter than they actually were. And then, you know, you'd have to decide. I know enough to know the league has moved away from super tall players, but even so, you'd have to decide if that, 6'8", 6'10" person was worth the fact that you're going to have to put some 5'6" people out there on the floor, and you'd find some under 6 people who are really undervalued because they can perform at a high level without eating too much of your height cap.
Right. So getting a short king would
Yes.
be an almost immeasurable advantage. Like you find the Muggsy Bogues. All right.
Right.
We got a guy who's 5'1". Well, holy shit. Now we can get a 6'11" guy out there on the court. Then you're
maybe-
cooking with gas.
Maybe paradoxically, this is good news. This brings back the era of the bigs. Maybe like Taco Fall or someone comes back in the league because there's so many like 5'8" guys. Like now maybe like being 7 feet, if you can do it, like maybe that is a big advantage because like no one's scoring or whatever. So I think this could really give you some height diversity in the league and some representation for people of all different heights who could finally see themselves represented in the NBA.
Finally,
What would
the
be your-
short people get their moment? Okay.
Yeah. What would be your ideal roster makeup? I don't think it's
yeah.
just 5-6 footers. I don't think that's true. I'm
Is it
I'm
Bol
with
Bol
Kay. I
and
think
4 short?
Well,
kings?
that would be the interesting thing. Are there teams that are kind of like spending all their allotment on one person and then having a bunch of shorts? Are there people that can have
Shorts.
this crazy lineup where like everyone is 6
Kings.
feet, like, and everyone in theory can like sort of rebound or whatever? Like I think you'd see teams finding different strategies, and one of the upsides is that instead of having to talk about basketball, everyone could spend their time not just talking about contracts but talking about height measurements, and that really is where the excitement is in the game, I think.
it's interesting that you came up with this because you come from tall culture, and
I come from I'm a
this is such
semi,
a nod to short culture.
Yes.
I'm a 6'1.5" person who is terrible at basketball. So this wouldn't help me or my or my line in any sense, but it would hopefully make the game more annoying, which is I think what everyone wants.
Well, you know what they do say, like, you can't teach readiness.
Yeah.
That's
Readiness
right.
is
Readiness
a skill.
it's something you can work at it, right? I think there are changes I could make to my lifestyle that might make me somewhat less reedy than I am now, or somewhat more reedy.
Are you declaring the major labels secret beef room collab on this pod right now?
It's finally happening. The major labels secret beef unreadiness 2022 project. This is huge, and I'm trying to. Again, I don't know if the height cap will affect me, but I'm trying. I heard there was a drawing for a beef room gift certificate that goes to the person who has had the worst basketball proposal on the podcast. So I'm hoping that I'm in the running for that.
Hey, I had multi-ball a few episodes ago, so you're good.
I'm with the height one. Kay, thanks so much for coming by here and for appearing in our newsletter. What a treat!
It's
two
the
2K
double
content drops.
the fulfillment of 2 lifelong dreams in the same week.
Everyone go out and buy major labels, available now via Penguin Books.
That's right. And send your complaints about the book directly to the Cookies Hoops podcast.
Our interns are right on. Thank you, Ken.
Thanks, dude.
Thank you.
I love cookies.
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 I love cookies. I love cookies.